Hi, David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTec 10. The subject material for this video is something that we can all do often for little or no costs, and that is lose mass from either various parts of the engine or our vehicle in total. There's nothing better for a race car than lack of mass. So let's get into this and see what we can do. My intent was to focus on engine parts when it came to mass loss. But let me say a few words on chassis, right? I mean the rest of the car other than the engine. Any mass you can lose off your car is going to make it faster, be it on the drag strip or on a road course or what. On a road course especially, we have the situation where the loss of mass means that not only will the car accelerate faster, but also it will stop faster and corner better. The reason for this is that there's more tire in contact with the road per pound weight of car. It's a win-win situation. But nevertheless, let's get on to engine parts. And the first thing I want to talk about is the reciprocating mass of the short block. Connecting rod. It's amazing how many times I see engines built with way too much connecting rod for the job. You do not need a connecting rod with any more strength than the RPM and horsepower level that you're going to go to. Now, most of my engines that I build are not all-out race engines. They are high-output street or street strip motors or track day engines. So I'm inclined to use a rod like this, which is not a maximum strength rod, it's just ample rod for the job. Why? Because what happens is you have too much rod, that means you've got more counterbalance. Wait, that means there's greater windage loss, there is greater moment of inertia in the engine. So all of this is on the downside. Now by using a lighter rod, and this is a scat rod that I use quite a few of, but there's other good brands out there as well. The beauty of it is that for every gram you lose off the big end means you can lose at least one off the counterweight. And if you know exactly where to take the metal off, you can actually lose more than one. Typically, I find that for every gram I lose off the big end, I can lose about 2 and sometimes as many as 3 grams off the crankshaft. Now, if this is by taking the metal off strategically in places where most people don't touch it. But that's a story for another time. Let's now look at the wrist pins, right? And piston weight. Now, wrist pins, here's a titanium one, right? This is one that I actually made up here, and it's done with a process. There's no coating on it as such. It's done with a heat treatment process which produces a very hard, low friction surface. Now, I'm not going to go into details on this because the guy I was working with appears not to be with us anymore, so this project never came to a final conclusion, although I guess I could pick it up with some other experts on heat treatment. Now let's have a look at this last pin here. I can't show you the guts of it, but this is something that I am working on. The nice thing about this, it's a steel pin, well, it's a steel composite pin, is that it weighs almost what a titanium pin is for the same weight, but it's only about half the price. I'm still working on these. I've got to break some before I can say they're okay. right? So more on that down the road. One of the worst places to have mass is in the valve train. The reason is that it goes back and forth. Reciprocating mass is always a problem. The most influential place to lose mass in a valve train is at the valve and everything that moves with the valve. Right, so let's look at that for a moment. Right, big block Chevy, titanium valve, weighs about 70%, maybe 65% of what a steel valve weighs. This is a Ferrea valve for a big block that I'm doing. Right now, a big block Chevrolet is very important on valve train because it's a big, heavy valve train. Start losing mass out of that valve train and it will pay dividends. So, where can we go from a titanium valve? Well, this is a project I was working on for Cosworth. Right, that valve weighs about 7 or 8 grams. You're also looking at a valve which costs nearly $50,000. Right, what's it made of? It's a carbon-carbon valve. Right, they take quite a bit to make. I'm not going to go into that now, but and here's another valve. This is a I don't think I can talk about this one. No. That's a lightweight valve. It's cheaper to make than this one, but it's only marginally heavier, right? Now, what is a titanium valve worth? Well, I did some tests on Crowler Spintron some time ago, and I tested a regular steel valve, a hollow stem Ferrea valve, and a Ferrea titanium valve, right? And you'll see the results come by. They'll go up the side here, right? As you can see, the hollow stem valve is a good halfway house to getting a titanium valve. And by the way, here's something to consider. If valve control is a problem, and it always is to a certain extent, then a sodium-filled exhaust valve is better behaved than just a regular hollow stem valve. What happens is when the sodium gets hot, it flops up and down inside the valve, and that tends to damp vibrations and bouncing off the seat. Not only is sodium exhaust valve good for that, but also it runs cooler, which means that it puts you just that little bit further away from detonation. Well, no, it doesn't put you further away from detonation, it puts your engine further away from detonation. Right, now then let's look at retainers. If we swap a steel retainer for a titanium retainer, then in an engine in around the 7,500 RPM range, we typically pick up about 100 RPM before we get to valve float. As we go up in RPM, that gets better. So a titanium retainer is worthwhile. But there's other ways we can reduce the weight of the retainer, and that is to use a spring which intrinsically saves weight due to the fact it takes a smaller retainer. A very good retainer to think about here is a tool steel retainer. Comp has some tool steel retainers for beehive springs that are, yeah, sure, they're steel, but there's less material there because the tool steel is just simply a much stronger material, right? So that's good. So always go for a spring combination that allows you to use the lightest retainer. Now we get to titanium retainers. Right, a simple titanium retainer is nothing more than a replica of a steel retainer, right? But we can get a little more esoteric. Here's one from Manley, and it was what was used in cup car engines maybe 15 years ago, right? and they were having problems with retainers wearing out due to rubbing on the spring when they were made of titanium. And so these oiling holes were put in. You'll see those when I do the close-up, right? It's light and it solved the problem of oiling. Now, let's look at something here like this one here. This, believe it or not, is an aluminum, a hard anodized aluminum retainer. And one of the things it's got on it here, and you'll have to look at the close-up on there, at the bottom of it, it is expanded. It's not just tapered like these. This is a burst ring, and I believe Harvey Crane came up with this because lightweight retainers, either in titanium or aluminum, were bursting at the bottom there, so this reinforces it. Now, other than that burst ring on there, there's nothing more to look at. Now, in an attempt to get it lighter, we've gone to these here with dimples in. I say we, right? That's the trend, right? These have got dimples in, right? And then in the extreme case, the dimples have been carried all the way through, and we've got holes. Now, making a retainer out of aluminum is a tricky business. They were done out of aluminum years ago, and I'm going back now to the 60s, and anodized, and that was quite popular for a while until it was found that the alloys that were being used didn't stand up very well. Well, these days there's aluminum alloys and surface treatments which can make an aluminum retainer live. And although there's no physical RPM advantage over a titanium one, that's because you have to make them thicker, they're a lot easier to make and cheaper. So let's have a look at the next point in contest here. Right. Back in one of my videos, I talked about some super trick pushrods. Let's take a look at those now. Here is a very expensive pushrod. This is one of the successful prototype pushrods. Now, it may not look like much. You'll notice it's got separate ends on it. These are made of coated titanium, and this pushrod itself is made of a metal matrix. In this case, it's a carbon aluminum matrix. Now, it's pretty complicated making these pushrods. What happens is you start off with a very, very thin piece of malleable aluminum, and you lay carbon strands along the aluminum. And we're going to roll this aluminum up. So we lay the strands along what will be the length of the pushrod, and then they are rolled up into a ball so that you have these aluminum fibers, carbon fibers inside the pushrod, right? And it's compacted. Then it's put into a conclave, which is basically a high pressure furnace, heated to just below melting point, and subjected to, I'm going to try and remember this, about 2000 psi, might be more, right? And that compacts it. And when it comes out, it looks like this. Very smooth and extremely light. I mean, this is about less than quarter the weight of a typical steel pushrod. Now, here's the beauty of it. It's not just that it's very strong, right? In terms of compression, it's extremely stiff, about 4 times stiffer than your typical chrome moly, race chrome moly pushrod. But the other thing is it damps vibrations. It is one of the most unlikely materials to vibrate you can come across. And it's the vibration resistance that is the asset here, right? in dyno test, or rather in spintron testing these, we found that at 8,000 RPM, the valve train could hold a motion profile that was almost identical to that at idle. Dynamics were extremely good. Now, why didn't they use them in Cup Car? Simple. Two reasons actually. One, they were difficult to make. It typically took 32 pushrods to get 16 that were functional, right? What would happen is unless the ends were absolutely perfectly put on and flat inside this thing here, and the resin that they put in there was touching everywhere, what would happen is if it was uneven, it would crumble that piece of the pushrod, and then the next bit would, and before you know it, the pushrod's got 1/8 of an inch shorter because it's broken each separate strand as it goes down. Well, that problem got solved, but they weren't any good for NASCAR stuff because at the time the Cup Cars had to use flat tappet cams, and they were lofting the valves, so they're getting about 30 or 40 thousandths more lift than the valve train had at idle. That depended on picking a pushrod which bent sufficiently to pole vault the valve over the nose or just after the nose to get this extra lift. These pushrods completely eliminate that, so they actually lost power. Now, for something with a roller cam, this would be ideal. Unfortunately, they're just too expensive to make. Although, I guess if competition gets stiff enough, the cost of anything to win will be justified. This is a carbon fiber pushrod. Pretty strong. Again, there's a few issues with them, but we're looking at testing these because they may be a cheaper alternative to the other one. Now let's go down and see what else there is. Oh yes, lifters, right? Big problem with flat tappet lifters is they gave out, right? And the big problem with making a titanium follower is that titanium tends to be a really good material to weld itself to anything that happens to be close, right? It's extremely non-anti-seize. Now, here's a lifter that I made some years ago now, and working with a friend of mine who seems not to be with us anymore, we did a special heat treatment on it, and it's virtually indestructible. If you look at this face under a magnifying glass, it looks like it's never been used. The reality is that on a moderate race cam, it's run 1,500 miles at Daytona speed, RPM. Right, so very good. It weighs about half of what a regular lightweight race steel lifter weighs. Now, the thing is why bother with a flat tappet lifter when you could use a roller lifter which doesn't have these seizing issues? Simple. You can make a more aggressive valve train with flat tappets and cheaper than you can with a roller. It's just that this needs to be big enough for the job. If you're making it out of steel, by the time it gets big enough for the job, it's usually a pretty heavy lifter. Here, it's not. Doing this process, this titanium lifter will not only survive, but the coefficient of friction on here, even without oil, the coefficient of friction on steel is pretty low. Put some oil on it and it's almost like ice on ice. So that's something else. Right, well that's all that I've got to talk about for this lightweight stuff. And let's see if any of it makes it to the mainstream market. Thank you for watching.